Chapter 1: Old Friends, New Tensions. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when my mom casually dropped the bombshell. She was rummaging through the pantry, probably looking for another bag of chips to feed her unending snack cravings. "Jennifer," she said, calling out to me from the kitchen. "I mean, Thai's back from Yale for spring break, Jacob." Thai, our neighbor, my childhood friend, the girl next door who had once decided at the age of 11 that her new American name would be Jennifer. I didn't even know how it started. One day she just said, "Jennifer," and that was it. I, of course, argued against it. I suggested something like Thea, which would at least sound somewhat similar to Thai. But she stuck to Jennifer, and over the years, only her family and I had the privilege of calling her by her original name. I never minded. It was one of those little things that made her, well, her. "Yeah, I know," I muttered, half focused on the bag of Fritos in front of me. My fingers worked their way through the chips as I mindlessly popped one into my mouth. "When's the last time you saw her?" my mom asked, her voice tinged with a certain curiosity that made me pause. I guess last summer. The Nguyens went skiing over Christmas, so she wasn't here then." "That's a long time for you too," she remarked, closing the pantry door with a soft thud. "I didn't think it was that long." Thai and I kept in touch throughout the year, mostly through messages. She was at Yale, and I was still here, taking classes at the U, stuck in the same old routine. So yeah, we didn't see each other in person as often, but we messaged at least once a week. The things we talked about didn't really matter. "Well, why don't you go check in?" my mom asked. "Yeah, sure," I replied without much enthusiasm, sticking another chip into my mouth. I wasn't in any rush to go see her, not that I would admit that to my mom. "You don't want to see her?" my mom asked, her voice carrying a little more emotion now. "Huh, what?" I glanced at her, a chip hanging between my fingers. "Well, you don't seem in any hurry." She was right, I wasn't exactly jumping at the idea. "You just mentioned it to me," I muttered, casually shrugging. "I'm not just going to go over there for no reason. It's not like I'm some knight in shining armor." She sighed heavily and leaned against the counter. "Guys don't ever get girlfriends either," she mumbled under her breath. My ears turned bright red. "What?" I asked, hoping I hadn't just heard what I thought I had. She didn't answer right away, choosing instead to grab an onion from the fridge. Her eyes flickered to mine as she added, "I just don't get you too." "Who?" "Me and Thai?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she sighed, exasperated. "For two people who fit together like you two do, it's just a waste is all." She paused for a beat. "Are you scared? Because I get that." "I understand." "Mom, we've talked about this before," I groaned, hoping she wouldn't push the conversation any further. "We're just friends. She dates. I date. We talk about our dates, but there's nothing like that between us." I didn't want to go into it further, not with my mom. "Must be a one-sided conversation," she muttered. "Haven't seen you go out on a date in a while." "I date," I muttered, feeling a little defensive now. "You haven't gone out in weeks," she shot back. "I've got this full-time job with school. I'm busy." "I know," she replied with a sigh, grabbing a piece of fruit from the fridge. "You don't have to tell me everything. Sometimes I think you don't have any secrets left." She turned to face me with a little smile. "It's not healthy, you know. For a kid as smart as you, there's got to be something you're hiding." "Well, don't worry," I said, giving her a smirk. "There's plenty of stuff you don't know about me." "Good," she replied, her smile widening. "I like that." I could tell the conversation wasn't going anywhere good, so I decided to bail. "All right, I'm going to go play some basketball," I said, grabbing my ball from the hallway. "Seems like a good idea," my mom called after me. As I walked toward the driveway, I could feel her eyes still on me, but I wasn't about to back down. Basketball was my escape, my therapy. I needed to clear my head. I made my way to the driveway, dribbling the basketball lazily as I bounced it off the pavement. The cool evening air was refreshing, and the rhythmic sound of the ball hitting the ground was oddly comforting. I wasn't thinking about Thai, at least not consciously, but the moment I stepped onto the court, my mind began to wander. It always did when I played. Basketball wasn't just about the game for me, it was a memory, a shared space with someone who knew me better than anyone else. A place where things weren't complicated. It was just me, the ball, and the basket. I launched the ball toward the hoop and missed by a mile. You still suck, huh? I spun around, startled, to find Thai standing at the edge of the driveway, leaning against the garage with her arms crossed. She was wearing those low-rise jeans that always made her look like she was effortlessly cool, and a simple white top that made her look even more gorgeous than usual. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, catching the light from the street lamp. "Thai," I said a bit too loudly, "when did you get here?" "About 5 minutes ago." "I've been standing here waiting for you to miss again," she teased, stepping toward me. "I wasn't missing on purpose," I muttered, trying to act unaffected by her presence, but there was no mistaking it. The air between us felt different now, heavier. Maybe it was because she was back for spring break, or maybe it was the way she was looking at me. I wasn't sure. "So, what's up with you, Jake?" she asked, as if we hadn't been friends for years, as if she was trying to peel back some layer of me that she hadn't seen before. I shrugged, same old stuff, school, work, you know the drill. She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I couldn't remember the last time we just hung out like this. Not since I got back from Cornell, at least. Not since, well, since everything started to feel like it was shifting. "Cool," she said, "so you haven't been out with anyone lately?" I raised an eyebrow, a little taken aback. "Not really, I'm kind of busy. What about you?" "Nothing serious," she replied with a shrug, though her lips curled into a faint smile that told me she wasn't being entirely honest. "But you know, there's always someone." I couldn't help it. The conversation was easy, playful even, but I felt a strange sense of discomfort rising in my chest. I had never seen Thai as anything more than my friend, but lately, I wasn't so sure anymore. She was different somehow, even though she looked the same. There was something about the way she stood, the way she spoke, that made me question everything. "You're still the same," I said, almost too quietly. "Well, minings." "You always know how to mess with me," I said, throwing the basketball in her direction as an attempt to dodge the weight of the conversation. She caught it effortlessly and bounced it a few times, her fingers grazing the ball with ease. "You always were a sucker for that," she teased, her grin widening. I watched her, trying to ignore the fluttering in my stomach. Why did it feel like everything had changed in the blink of an eye? Why did I suddenly feel like I was about to slip on ice? "So," Thai began again, her tone suddenly serious. "You've been good, really." I hesitated before answering. "I'm fine, just figuring things out." "Yeah, I get that," she said, her expression softening. She took a few steps closer, and for a second I thought I imagined the subtle shift in the air. I didn't move. My eyes met hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw something in them that wasn't just friendship. A flicker of something more, something I wasn't ready for. Before I could say anything, she spoke again. "You know, Jake, we've been friends for a long time, but I think it's about time we figure out what happens next." "What do you mean?" I asked, unsure of where this was going. My heart was beating faster now, and I couldn't tell if it was from the basketball game or from the strange tension building between us. She tilted her head, as if considering how much she wanted to say. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think you know what I mean." The words hung in the air like a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to face. There had always been a certain ease between us, an unspoken understanding that we were there for each other no matter what. But lately that ease felt like a distant memory, and now, standing in front of her, I realized that there was something between us that I didn't want to admit. Thai was still watching me, her eyes searching mine, waiting for me to say something. I swallowed hard. Thigh, we've been through a lot. We're just friends, right? Her lips quirked into a smile. Are we? Or have we been lying to ourselves all this time? I took a deep breath. My mind was racing. The ball bounced aimlessly against the pavement, and the sound seemed louder than ever. I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what we're doing. She stepped closer, her breath mingling with mine. Maybe it's time we figure it out. Maybe it's time for something more. The silence between us deepened. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I knew was that in this moment, nothing felt like it was supposed to. Thigh was right in front of me, and everything I had told myself about our friendship was suddenly in question. Chapter 3: The Unspoken Truths. The night was quiet, but it felt like the world around me had shifted. Thigh was standing right in front of me, and I felt like I was losing grip on something I'd taken for granted all these years. Our friendship had always been simple. We'd known each other since we were kids, and that was enough. But tonight, something felt different. Thigh was looking at me like she was waiting for me to say something, to make sense of this tangled mess of emotions I didn't even fully understand myself. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. It was like I was frozen, stuck in this moment where everything that had once been so clear was now clouded by the possibility of something more. She took a step forward, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Jake, you know, I've always felt like I could talk to you about anything, and I don't want to mess that up, but she trailed off, glancing away for a moment before meeting my eyes again. But maybe I'm tired of pretending like nothing's changed between us. I swallowed hard. What are you saying? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. It felt like the air around us had thickened, like the words we were dancing around had a weight to them that I wasn't ready for. She exhaled, her breath shaky. I'm saying that I'm not sure I want to pretend anymore, she said, her gaze intense. I'm not sure I want to keep lying to myself that you're just my friend. Because that's not how I feel anymore. I felt my heart race, and for the first time in a long time, I was scared. The kind of scared you get when you realize you've been walking on the edge of something for a long time, and now, finally, the ground beneath you is giving way. Thigh and I had been friends for so long. We'd spent hours together, talking about everything from school to life to love, but I'd never allowed myself to think of her in any way other than my best friend. We had never crossed that line. But now, standing here, I could see that we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us had prepared for. I don't know if I can, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I don't know if I can handle that. If we did something like that, it wouldn't be the same anymore. And I'm scared. I don't want to mess everything up. Thigh's face softened, and she stepped closer, just a few inches between us now. Jake, I'm not asking you to change everything. I'm not asking for anything to be perfect. Her voice dropped to a whisper, her words hanging in the air. I'm just asking if you feel the same way, if there's a chance that we could be more than just friends. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, and it was as if time had stopped. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, but I couldn't find the words. What if this changed everything? What if it didn't work? What if, after all these years, we couldn't go back? But looking at her, really looking at her, I realized that I couldn't deny it any longer. I had always cared about Thigh more than I cared about anyone else. She knew me in ways no one else ever would, and maybe, just maybe, I was ready to explore what lay beyond the boundaries of our friendship. I took a deep breath, my chest tight. I don't know what I'm doing, Thigh, I confessed. But I think I want to try. I think I want to see where this goes. She smiled, a small, relieved smile, and took a step closer, her hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. That's all I need to hear. And just like that, everything changed. The air between us was charged now, filled with a new kind of tension, one I wasn't sure I could handle, but one I was willing to face. She stepped even closer, her fingers lightly brushing against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through my body. I looked down at her hand, then back up at her face, and for a moment we both stood there in silence, not sure what came next. I could feel my pulse quicken, and I knew deep down that whatever happened next would shape the rest of our lives. Jake, Thigh murmured, her voice low, I know this isn't easy, but I've never wanted anything more than to see what we could be together. I didn't know if I was ready for what was about to happen, but I was already past the point of no return. I reached out, my fingers finding hers, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something real, something I couldn't take back. Chapter 4, Crossing the Line. It happened so quickly, and yet it felt like we had been building up to this moment for years. Thigh's fingers tightened around mine, her grip warm and steady, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. It wasn't just the air between us that had changed, it was everything. The world felt quieter, like we were the only two people left in it. We stood there, just looking at each other, the words neither of us had said hanging in the air. There was so much unsaid, so many emotions bubbling under the surface that I wasn't sure how to deal with. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel my palms getting clammy. This was the moment we had both been avoiding for so long. The moment we crossed from something safe, something familiar, into something new, something unknown. Jake, Thigh whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my racing heartbeat. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just curiosity or hesitation, it was something deeper. Something I was afraid to explore. Are you sure? I wasn't sure of anything anymore. I had spent my whole life thinking of her as my best friend, someone I could always count on, someone who would never let me down. But now, standing here, I realized that I had been blind. I had been blind to how she had grown into someone I wanted, someone I couldn't ignore anymore. I don't know if I'm sure, I said, my voice shaking just slightly. But I think I need to know. I think we need to know. Thigh nodded, her lips parting as if she was going to say something, but then, as if on instinct, she leaned forward and kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, like she was testing the waters, unsure of how far to go. But I responded immediately, pulling her closer, my hands finding their way to her back, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath the fabric of her shirt. I kissed her deeper, the world around us blurring into nothing. This was everything I had been afraid of, and everything I had wanted. The feel of her lips on mine, the way her body pressed against mine, was electric. But even in the intensity of the kiss, I could still feel the weight of our history. This wasn't just a moment of passion, it was years of friendship, years of shared memories, years of pretending nothing could happen between us. And now here we were, finally acknowledging what had always been there. She pulled back slightly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her face was flushed, her eyes dark with emotion. She looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I don't want to mess this up, Jake, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want to lose you. My heart ached at her words. I could feel the same fear building up in me. This was risky. We had always been friends, always been there for each other. But now everything was different. There was no going back. I don't want to lose you either, Thigh, I whispered. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't pretend like this is just friendship. She smiled softly, and I felt something inside me ease. She understood. She had always understood me in ways no one else ever could. I know, she said quietly. I feel it too. Her fingers brushed the back of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. I felt like I was on the edge of something big, something life-changing. But even with the fear, even with the uncertainty, there was something else, something that felt right. And in that moment, I knew we couldn't go back. We had already crossed that line, and there was no uncrossing it. Without a word, she pulled me back into the kiss, her hands threading through my hair, tugging me closer, as if she couldn't get enough of me. I didn't know how to describe what I was feeling. It was like we were both afraid, but we were both so incredibly sure of this moment that nothing else seemed to matter. We pulled apart just enough for her to glance up at me, her forehead resting against mine. Do you want to? Do you want to take this further? She asked softly, her voice uncertain but full of something I couldn't name. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. I had always imagined this moment, but it had never seemed real until now. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was about everything we had built, everything we had shared, and suddenly I didn't want to lose any of it. I do, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. I want to take this further, but we have to be careful, we have to be sure. She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. We will be, she said softly. Chapter 5: The Struggle of Transition. The next few hours passed in a blur. We stayed in the driveway, talking, laughing, sharing little moments of intimacy that felt both new and strangely familiar. There was still the weight of our history between us, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like the foundation we had built for years, now serving as the bridge to something new. But even with that, the reality of what we had just done started to sink in. It was easy to get caught up in the excitement, the rush of our newfound closeness, but I knew we couldn't ignore what this meant for us. It wasn't just a kiss, it wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was a shift, a big one. We had crossed that line, and now we had to figure out where we went from here. As we sat on the hood of my car, looking out at the stars, the questions began to pile up. How do we go back to just being friends after this? I asked, my voice tinged with uncertainty. Thai looked over at me, her hand resting on mine. We don't, she said simply. We can't. I didn't know what I was expecting, but her answer still caught me off guard. Then what do we do now? She shrugged, a playful grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. We figure it out. Together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Chapter 6: The Tension of Change. The next few days were filled with an uneasy calm. Everything had changed, but nothing had fully sunk in yet. Thai and I were still figuring out how to exist in this new space between us. We had spent years knowing exactly where we stood, but now there were too many unspoken things hanging in the air. There were the casual touches, the stolen glances, the moments where our old friendship tried to resurface, but neither of us could quite ignore the new dynamic we were trying to navigate. Every time I saw her, I felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of what we used to be and what we could be now. There were times when I'd catch her looking at me in a way I couldn't quite place, like she was still trying to figure me out, or like she was waiting for me to make the next move. But it wasn't just me who was struggling with the change. Thai was too, though she didn't admit it. She was always so sure of herself, so confident in everything she did. But when we were together now, I could see the cracks in her composure, the subtle moments of hesitation. The old Thai, the one who had always been bold and fearless, seemed to be treading carefully around me, as if waiting for something to break. I noticed it most when we were alone, when the silence stretched a little too long, when we found ourselves in spaces where we used to be comfortable, but now nothing felt quite the same. We had decided to go for a walk that evening, just to get some fresh air, to clear our heads. I didn't know what to say to her. There was a weight between us now that hadn't been there before. I kept thinking about our kiss, about what had changed. We had crossed a line, and now it felt like we were both looking at each other from the other side. So, Thai started, breaking the silence. What now? Her question caught me off guard. I looked at her, trying to read her expression. She was walking a few steps ahead of me, her hands stuffed in the pockets of her jacket. The evening sky was dark, but there was a soft light from the street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. The air was cool, crisp, and a little damp. It felt like the kind of night where anything could happen. What do you mean? I asked, unsure if I even wanted to hear her answer. She turned to face me, her brow furrowed. I mean, We've been through a lot together, but now it's different. It's not just friendship anymore. So what do we do with that? I paused, trying to gather my thoughts. I don't know, I admitted. It's strange, isn't it? Thigh nodded slowly, her eyes locking with mine. Yeah, it's like we're standing at the edge of something, and neither of us knows whether to jump or step back. I felt my stomach flip. Her words hit too close to home. I had been thinking the same thing, but hearing her say it out loud made it more real, more tangible. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that everything would be fine, that we could figure this out. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if we could go back to the way things were, or if I even wanted to. So, do you think we should just pretend like it didn't happen? I asked quietly, my voice betraying the uncertainty I was feeling. Thigh's eyes softened and she stepped closer to me. I don't want to pretend, but I also don't want to rush into anything we're not ready for. I need to know if this is something real, Jake. If this is something worth risking everything for. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. Part of me wanted to grab her hand, to tell her that it was real, that this was worth it. But another part of me was scared that if we pushed too hard, too fast, we'd ruin everything. I think it's real, I said after a long pause, my voice low. But I also think we need time to figure out what that means. What we means now. She smiled, a soft, understanding smile. Yeah, I think you're right. We've always had time, Jake. We've had years. So maybe it's okay if we take this slow. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until she said it. There was comfort in her words, in the reassurance that we didn't have to rush, that we didn't have to have all the answers right away. You're right, I said, smiling back at her. We've got time. We stood there for a moment, both of us feeling the tension ease just a little. There was still uncertainty, still a sense of vulnerability that hadn't been there before, but it didn't feel as heavy now. Maybe we didn't have all the answers, but at least we were figuring it out together. Okay, she said softly. So we'll figure it out together. Chapter 7: The Strain of Uncertainty. A few days passed, and things between Thigh and me seemed to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. We still spent time together, hanging out like we used to, but there were moments when I would catch her looking at me in a way I didn't quite understand, or when I would feel her hand brush against mine, and I would wonder if things had really changed as much as we thought. It wasn't just the two of us who seemed to notice. Everyone else started to get curious. My mom, for one, kept asking if I had finally figured it out with Thigh. My friends started dropping hints, making comments about how close we were. The pressure was starting to build again, and I could feel it, pushing down on me every time we were together. Thigh noticed it too. I could tell by the way she started pulling away at times, as if she didn't want to let anyone in on what was really happening between us. There were moments when I felt like she was hiding something from me, and I wasn't sure what it was. Jake, can we talk? Thigh said one evening, pulling me aside after our usual hangout with friends. I nodded, my heart suddenly racing. Yeah, of course. She led me to a quiet spot in the yard, away from the noise of the others. The moon was high above, casting a soft light over everything. I could feel her tension in the air, and it made my own nerves spike. What's going on? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting away from me before she finally spoke. I don't know, Jake, I don't know what's happening with us anymore. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean, we're not really talking about it. We're not really facing it, she said, her voice shaky. And I don't want to lose you, but I'm not sure where we're going anymore. Are we friends, or are we something else? I need to know. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The uncertainty I had been feeling for the past few days was suddenly too much to bear. I think we need to figure it out too, I said, finally finding my voice. But I don't want to lose you either, Thigh. You're important to me. Her eyes softened. I don't want to lose you either, Jake. I just need to know that we're not wasting time. Chapter 8, Facing the Fear. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words, until it felt like I could barely breathe. Thai's gaze was steady, but I could see the uncertainty there, lurking just beneath the surface. The question she had asked, the one that had been hanging in the air for days, had finally been voiced, and I could no longer hide from it. I don't know what to tell you, Thai, I said, the words coming out almost too quietly. I don't know what we are. I just know I don't want to lose you, and I don't want to mess this up. Her expression softened, but there was still something distant in her eyes. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as if she were gathering her thoughts. I don't want to mess this up either, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but we can't keep dancing around it. We need to face it, Jake. I know, I replied, feeling the weight of her words settle on my shoulders. It's just everything has changed, and I don't know how to be what you need right now. The uncertainty in my voice made her flinch. It wasn't what I wanted to say, but it was the truth. We had always been able to talk about anything, but now this, whatever this was something neither of us had prepared for. It was new territory, and I didn't know how to navigate it. Thai stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch mine. Her fingers were warm, and the gesture was so simple, so comforting, that for a brief moment, the world around us seemed to slow down. We'll figure it out, she said, her eyes locking with mine. But we have to be honest with ourselves. We can't keep pretending we don't feel this. We can't keep pretending this isn't real. I felt a knot in my stomach. She was right. We had both been pretending in our own ways that what had happened between us didn't matter, that it was just a moment, a lapse in judgment. But I knew deep down it was more than that. It had always been more than that. And now it was time to stop pretending. I think I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely a murmur. Me too, Thai said, her fingers tightening around mine. But I think if we don't face it, we'll end up losing each other for good. I don't want that, Jake. I don't think you do either. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I realized then that this wasn't just about figuring out what we were. It was about facing our fears, confronting everything we had been avoiding for so long. We had always danced around our feelings, always used the safety of our friendship to keep things simple. But now, there was no hiding anymore, no running away from what was happening between us. I'm not ready to lose you, Thai, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't want to lose you either. She smiled, a soft, tender smile, and squeezed my hand. Then let's stop pretending, okay? Let's stop pretending like this doesn't matter. Let's figure it out together. Chapter 9, The Strain of Expectations. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act. Thai and I were still trying to figure out what this new phase of our relationship meant, but the pressure was starting to build. It wasn't just the uncertainty we were grappling with, it was the expectations of everyone around us. My mom kept dropping hints, asking when I was going to figure things out with Thai, as if it were a simple thing to resolve. My friends were starting to notice the subtle shifts between us, and I could feel their curiosity simmering just beneath the surface. And then there was Thai. As much as she seemed confident on the outside, I knew she was struggling with the same questions I was. Was this real? Was it worth risking everything? We hadn't fully addressed those fears, not yet. Instead, we had been filling the space between us with casual conversations, distractions, and moments of laughter. But deep down, I knew that we couldn't ignore it forever. One afternoon, as we sat together on the couch in her living room, the tension was palpable. Thai was scrolling through her phone, absently tapping at the screen while I stared at the TV, my mind elsewhere. We were side by side, but it felt like there was an invisible wall between us. Neither of us knew how to bridge the gap that had been growing ever since we kissed. I think we need to talk, I said, finally breaking the silence. Sai looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing slightly. About what? About everything, I replied, my voice steady despite the anxiety twisting in my chest. About what happens next. About where we go from here. She sighed, setting her phone down on the coffee table and looking at me seriously. Yeah, I think we need to talk too. I don't know what's going on between us, Jake. One minute, everything feels right, and then the next, I feel like we're falling apart. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It was the same for me. The highs were intoxicating, but the lows were overwhelming. Every time we kissed, every time we shared a quiet moment together, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was on the line, that if we got it wrong, we might lose everything we had built. I don't want to fall apart, I said, my voice low, but I'm scared. I'm scared of what we're becoming, and I don't know if I'm ready for it. Thai looked at me, her eyes searching mine, as if she were trying to read my thoughts. I'm scared too, she admitted. I'm scared of losing you. I'm scared that this, whatever this is, will ruin what we have, but I don't think we can go back to the way it was. I don't think I can pretend anymore. The words hung between us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. I could feel the weight of her confession settling over me, and I realized then that we were both terrified of what was happening. We had stepped into unfamiliar territory, and neither of us knew how to navigate it. We have to decide what we want, Thai, I said, finally breaking the silence. We can't keep going back and forth. We can't keep pretending this doesn't matter. She nodded slowly, her gaze steady. I know, but I don't know what I want either. I don't know if I'm ready to risk everything, but I don't want to lose you. Chapter 10. The Moment of Truth. The conversation continued late into the evening, but even as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. We couldn't keep dancing around the issue forever. We had to make a choice. And the more we talked, the more I realized that the choice wasn't just about what we were doing right now. It was about our future and whether we were willing to risk it all for each other. I think we need some time, Thai said, her voice breaking the silence. Some space to figure out what we really want, to stop rushing into things just because we're scared of what's next. I nodded, agreeing with her. As much as I wanted to take the leap with her, I knew that we couldn't rush this. We needed to find our footing to make sure that whatever we were building was real. Yeah, I said softly, time sounds good. But no matter what happens, Thai, I don't want to lose you. Her eyes softened and she reached out to touch my hand. You won't lose me, Jake. We're in this together. And for the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Maybe we didn't have all the answers, but we had each other, and for now, that was enough. Chapter 11, Straining at the Edges. The days that followed our conversation felt strangely peaceful, but beneath the calm, there was a tension I couldn't shake. Thai and I were still figuring things out, still trying to navigate this new chapter of our lives, but it felt like we were both holding back. We weren't talking about everything, and the silence between us seemed louder than the words we used. It wasn't that we were avoiding each other, it was the opposite. We spent more time together than usual, but there was an unspoken agreement that we wouldn't push too hard. We'd go on walks, sit in silence, talk about everything except the thing that mattered the most. It was as if we were both waiting for the other person to make the first move, to decide what came next. But I could feel it building, that quiet pressure between us. Every time we looked at each other, I felt like I was being pulled in two directions. I wanted to be close to her, to tell her everything I was feeling, but I couldn't shake the fear that once we crossed that line again, there would be no going back. One evening, a week after our talk, we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of purple and pink, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the weight of everything between us press in. I think we need to stop pretending, I said suddenly, my voice breaking the silence. Thai looked at me, her eyes soft but filled with something else. What do you mean? I hesitated. I mean, we can't keep acting like nothing has changed. We need to face what's happening between us. I can't keep pretending I'm not falling for you. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. She just stared at me, her eyes searching mine, as if she were trying to decide whether to believe me or not. You think you're falling for me? She asked quietly. I nodded slowly, the words coming more easily now. Yeah, I don't know how to explain it, but I can't ignore it anymore. I care about you, Thai. More than I've ever cared about anyone else, and I can't pretend I don't feel that. Thai swallowed hard, her eyes glistening in the fading light. Jake, I don't know what to do with that, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know what's happening between us, but I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to lose what we have. I reached out, taking her hand gently in mine. I don't want to lose you either. But I think we have to stop pretending that we're just friends, that we don't feel this. We've been dancing around it for so long, but it's not going to go away, so we either face it or we lose it all. She squeezed my hand, her grip tight. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Jake. I don't know if I can take that step. What if it ruins everything? I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been gnawing at me for days. I knew we both wanted something more, but the risk of losing everything was overwhelming. Maybe it will, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But maybe it won't. I don't know what's going to happen. But I know I can't keep pretending. I can't keep ignoring what's right in front of us. Thai sat in silence, her fingers still intertwined with mine. I could feel the weight of her decision hanging in the air, the unspoken truth between us. We both knew that once we took this step, we couldn't go back, but I also knew that I couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Not again. I'm scared, Jake, she said softly, breaking the silence. I don't want to lose you. I pulled her closer, my chest tight with emotion. You won't lose me, Thai, I promise. Chapter 12, The Complication of Us. Things changed after that conversation, but not in the way I thought they would. We didn't suddenly become a couple, and we didn't have some grand moment of realization. Instead, we began to shift slowly into something new. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. The moments of quiet affection became more frequent. Small touches, lingering glances, the way our conversations lingered just a little longer than they used to. But there were also the moments of hesitation, the silent spaces between us when the weight of what we were doing would hit us both at once. The fear of messing up, of letting something slip that we weren't ready to confront, loomed over us. One afternoon, a week later, we found ourselves sitting in her living room, the TV on, but neither of us really paying attention. We were both lost in our thoughts, each of us trying to navigate this new terrain without knowing exactly where it would lead. You know, Thai said after a long pause, her voice light but filled with something I couldn't quite place, this is weird. It's like we're more than we were, but also less. Like we're friends, but not really, and we're something more, but we're still figuring it out. I smiled softly, knowing exactly what she meant. Yeah. It's like walking in the dark, trying to figure out which way to go. She laughed, but it was a bittersweet sound. Exactly. I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know if I'm ready to take that step. What if we mess everything up? What if it changes everything? I reached out and gently touched her arm. I don't think we can control everything, Thai. We can't control the way we feel. We can't control where this goes, but we can control how we handle it. And as long as we're honest with each other, I think we'll be okay. She looked at me, her eyes soft, and for the first time in a while, I saw the familiar spark of trust between us. It wasn't the same as before, it couldn't be, but it was something new, something that felt like it had the potential to grow into something more, something deeper. I hope so, Jake, she said quietly, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. I really do. Chapter 13: External Pressures. As the days went on, it became clear that the tension wasn't just internal. External pressures were starting to build. Our friends noticed the subtle changes between us, the way we spent more time together, the way we lingered in moments that would have felt casual before. My mom was the first to bring it up. So, she said one evening as we sat together at dinner, her eyes glancing between me and the empty seat where Thai usually sat, "When are you two finally going to admit what's going on?" I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to act casual. She raised an eyebrow, a knowing look in her eyes. "Come on, Jake, I'm not blind, I can see it, the way you two look at each other now. Don't try to hide it." I wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't that I didn't want to tell my mom, but I wasn't ready for the world to know what Thai and I were still figuring out. "Mom, it's not like that," I said quickly, trying to downplay the situation. "We're just figuring things out." She sighed and smiled softly, her gaze softening. "You don't have to hide it from me, Jake. I've seen you two grow up together. I know there's something between you. Just don't let fear stop you from going after what you want." Chapter 14: External Pressures and Personal Revelations. The days that followed felt like a blur. Thai and I were more open about our feelings, but that only seemed to invite more questions from the people around us. My mom had dropped the bombshell first, but it didn't end there. Our friends noticed the tension between us too obvious to ignore, and their teasing comments started to feel more like pressure than jokes. Everyone seemed to want an answer, and every time someone asked me about Thai, I felt like I was holding my breath. It was one afternoon, sitting together in the park, when Thai turned to me with a troubled expression. We had been quiet for a while, the weight of our conversations lingering in the silence between us. "Jake, we can't keep doing this," she said, her voice tight. "We can't keep pretending everything's fine, like we don't know what's happening. Everyone is starting to notice." "I know," I replied, feeling the same unease creep into my chest. "But I don't know what to say. What if we're just overthinking things?" "Overthinking things?" Thai's voice was sharp, her eyes searching mine. "Jake, this isn't just about us anymore. Everyone is watching. My mom's been asking about you, and now my friends keep asking me if I'm seeing someone. It's like we're supposed to have a label, a definition." The frustration in her voice hit me harder than I expected. I understood where she was coming from. Everyone was putting us on display, trying to figure out where we stood. We couldn't keep hiding in the gray area, pretending this was something casual when it was clearly becoming something more. "I don't want to rush things, Thai," I said quietly, "but I don't want to keep this a secret either. If we're going to figure this out, we need to face it head on." Thai nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "I know. But what if we're not ready? What if we still don't know where this is going?" I reached for her hand, my thumb brushing over her knuckles. "We won't know unless we try, right? But I don't want anyone else's opinion to decide this for us. We have to decide for ourselves." Her eyes locked with mine, and for the first time in days, I saw the uncertainty in her soften, replaced by something else. Maybe it was the trust that had always been there, the bond that had never truly broken, even when we were on the edge of something unknown. "Okay," she whispered, "let's figure it out together." Chapter 15: Making a Choice. The decision had been made, but it didn't feel like a resolution. It felt like the beginning of something new, something that would require both of us to commit fully. I realized then that this wasn't just about us figuring out our relationship. It was about confronting our fears, admitting what we really wanted, and allowing ourselves to take that leap of faith. I found myself thinking about the future, about what Thai and I could become, and the risks involved in giving ourselves to something that wasn't guaranteed. But as the days passed, I realized that no relationship was ever guaranteed. There was always a risk of hurt, of change, of loss, but it was the only way to move forward. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, watching the stars from her living room window, I turned to Thai, my heart racing in my chest. Thai, I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. I want to take the next step. I want us to be more than just this in between. I don't want to keep holding back. She looked at me, her face softening, and I saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She had always been the stronger one in our friendship, the one who seemed to have it all figured out. But now, as she stared at me, I saw a flicker of doubt, of uncertainty, and I realized she was just as scared as I was. I feel the same way, she said quietly, her voice trembling. But what if we can't make it work? What if we ruin everything? I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll never know unless we try. We can't keep living in the what if. We've already been down that road, and it's not getting us anywhere. Thai nodded slowly, her eyes closing for a moment as if she were letting the weight of the decision settle in her chest. When she opened them again, there was a sense of resolve in her gaze. Okay, she said, her voice strong. Let's do this. Let's be real about it. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. And with that, everything changed. We weren't just friends anymore. We weren't just two people tiptoeing around each other. We were something else, something more. And as much as that scared me, it also filled me with a sense of hope. For the first time, I felt like I was ready to build something real. Chapter 16, Transformation and Growth. As the weeks passed, Thai and I began to settle into this new version of our relationship. It wasn't without its challenges. We still had moments of doubt, moments where we questioned whether we had made the right choice. The pressure from our families and friends didn't let up, and sometimes it felt like we were under a microscope. But as we navigated the complexities of what it meant to be more than friends, I realized that the struggle wasn't about other people, it was about us. We were both learning how to be vulnerable, how to communicate our fears, our desires, our dreams. We were learning how to grow together, not just as two individuals, but as a couple. And to my surprise, it wasn't as difficult as I had thought it would be. There was a natural ease to it, a flow that felt familiar. Maybe it was because we had always known each other so well, or maybe it was because, deep down, we had always been more than friends. I remember one afternoon when we sat together on the beach, the waves crashing softly against the shore. Thai leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a moment everything felt perfect. The world faded away, and it was just the two of us sharing a quiet moment. You know, she said, her voice soft, I think we've grown a lot. Both of us. I smiled, looking down at her. Yeah, we have. I think we're ready for whatever comes next, she said, lifting her head to look at me, no matter how messy or complicated it gets. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. We've got this, Thai, together. And in that moment, I believed it. We had come so far, and no matter what the future held, I knew we were ready to face it together. Chapter 17. A New Beginnings. A year later, as we stood together at the edge of the lake, watching the sun set behind the trees, I realized just how much had changed. Thai and I had navigated the twists and turns of our relationship, learning from our mistakes and growing stronger because of them. The pressure, the doubts, the fears